They say blood is thicker than water, but I learned the hard way that greed is thicker than both. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this is the story of how my own family tried to rob me blind at my grandmother's estate sale, only to discover that the real treasure was hidden where none of them thought to look. What I found in that basement didn't just change my bank account, it changed everything I thought I knew about the woman who raised me and the legacy she left behind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I've spent most of my 34 years being invisible. Not literally, of course, but in all the ways that matter when you're the middle child in a family that measures worth by bank statements and job titles. While my older brother Bobby built his real estate empire in Charlotte, flipping million-dollar properties and driving his pristine BMW to country club meetings, I've been stamping due dates on library books and balancing small business ledgers from my cramped studio apartment above Henderson's Used Books in downtown Asheville. Every family gathering felt like a performance where I never knew my lines. Bobby would arrive with stories of closing another six-figure deal, his perfectly pressed suits and confident handshake making everyone lean in to hear about his latest investment property. My younger sister Jess wasn't far behind, fresh from her marketing executive position in Atlanta, scrolling through her phone to show off the latest campaign she'd launched for some tech startup. Her designer heels clicking against Grandma Maggie's old hardwood floors as she paced around describing her corner office view. Then there was me, Sarah the librarian, Sarah the part-time bookkeeper, Sarah who still drove the same Honda Civic she'd bought used 7 years ago, and whose biggest professional victory was successfully organizing the annual library book fair. When relatives asked what I was up to, I'd mumble something about helping local businesses with their accounting while shelving returns, watching their eyes glaze over as they quickly turned their attention back to Bobby's latest property acquisition or Jess's promotion trajectory. Grandma Maggie never made me feel small though, in her cozy Victorian house on Maple Street, surrounded by her collection of what everyone else called old junk. She'd listen to my stories about the regular library patrons, about Mrs. Chen who came in every Tuesday for romance novels, or about teenage Marcus who was working his way through every science fiction series we had. She'd nod thoughtfully, her weathered hands wrapped around her coffee mug, and say things like books choose their readers, Sarah, just like people choose their purpose. I never understood what she meant by that, but something in her voice made it sound important. Grandma Maggie had raised the three of us after our parents died in that car accident when I was 12. She was the steady presence who made sure we did our homework, attended every school event, and somehow managed to put all three of us through college on a seamstress's pension and Social Security. Everyone in the family called her a saint, but they said it in that patronizing way people use when they mean someone is kind but not particularly impressive. She lived simply in that big house, mending clothes for neighbors, tending her garden, and spending hours in her basement workshop doing what she called puttering around. When family visited, they'd politely admire her vegetable garden and compliment her homemade biscuits, but I could see them exchanging glances when she'd disappear downstairs for hours at a time. Grandma's getting a bit eccentric in her old age, Bobby would whisper to Jess, and they'd both nod knowingly. But I loved those moments when she'd emerge from the basement with paint smudges on her fingers, her eyes bright with excitement about some project she was working on. She'd try to tell us about it, but Bobby would usually interrupt with some story about his business, and Jess would start talking about her latest client presentation. Eventually Grandma Maggie stopped trying to share what she was doing down there, but I'd catch her watching me sometimes with this look, like she was trying to tell me something important without words. My routine at the library was as predictable as sunrise. I'd unlock the doors at 8:30, check in returned books, help patrons find what they needed, and process late fees with the patience of someone who understood that $3 could be the difference between groceries and gas for some of our regulars. The work wasn't glamorous, but it felt meaningful in small ways. I knew which teenagers needed a quiet place to study, which elderly patrons enjoyed chatting about the weather, and which business owners were struggling to keep their books balanced. That's how I started doing part-time bookkeeping. Word spread that the librarian was good with numbers and didn't judge anyone for their financial struggles. Soon I was spending evenings in the back rooms of local cafes and small shops, helping owners make sense of their receipts and tax obligations. The work paid enough to cover my modest rent and keep my old Honda running, but it wasn't the kind of success story that impressed anyone at family dinners. David, my boyfriend of 2 years, worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm in Asheville. He was practical and reliable, qualities I appreciated after watching too many of my friends cycle through dramatic relationships. But lately our conversations had taken on an edge of frustration that made my stomach clench. He'd look around my tiny apartment with its second-hand furniture and library book stacks, then mention his coworker who just bought a condo, or suggest maybe I should consider getting my CPA license to maximize my earning potential. The unspoken message was clear. At 34, I should have achieved more, accumulated more, become more than a part-time librarian who lived above a bookstore. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me with the same expression I'd seen on Bobby and Jess's faces when they thought I wasn't paying attention, a mixture of pity and impatience that made me feel like I was failing some test I didn't even know I was taking. When Grandma Maggie started showing signs of her final illness, the family dynamic shifted in predictable ways. Bobby hired a care service and visited twice a month, usually staying just long enough to assess her condition and make sure the hired help was adequate. Jess called regularly but always seemed distracted, taking work calls during conversations and cutting visits short for client meetings or networking events. I found myself spending more and more time at
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
the house on Maple Street, bringing groceries, helping with medications and sitting with Grandma Maggie during the long afternoons when she was too tired for much more than holding hands and watching old movies. She'd doze in her recliner while I organized her bills or tidied the kitchen, and sometimes I'd hear her mumbling in her sleep about making sure it's all documented properly, or the collection needs to be preserved. During those final weeks, she seemed agitated about something she couldn't quite express. She'd ask me to bring her certain books from the basement, old art history volumes and regional culture guides that seemed random to me. She'd flip through them with trembling fingers, stopping at certain pages and nodding as if confirming something important. When I asked what she was looking for, she'd pat my hand and say, "Just making sure everything is in order, sweetheart. You'll understand when the time comes." The night she passed, I was holding her hand in the hospital room while Bobby and Jess handled the practical arrangements from the hallway, their voices carrying through the thin walls as they discussed funeral homes and obituary notices. Her last words to me were barely a whisper. "The real treasures are behind the stories, Sarah. Remember that when they start dividing things up." I thought she was confused from the medication, but something in her eyes looked completely lucid, urgent even. She squeezed my hand with surprising strength and repeated, "Behind the stories. Promise me you'll remember." The funeral was a blur of casseroles and condolences, distant relatives flying in from various states to pay their respects to the woman who'd somehow managed to put 3 kids through college and maintain that big house on a modest income. Everyone praised her kindness, her resilience, her ability to make the best biscuits in Buncombe County. They spoke about her as if she'd been a sweet, simple woman who'd lived a quiet, unremarkable life devoted to her family. Standing at the graveside, listening to the pastor read from scripture while watching Bobby check his phone and Jess whisper to her boyfriend about their flight back to Atlanta, I felt like they were burying a stranger. The Grandma Maggie they described bore no resemblance to the woman who'd disappear into her basement workshop for hours, who'd get that mysterious excited look when she talked about projects, who'd collected art books, and spent her final days worried about documentation and preservation. But there was no time to process these thoughts because Bobby had already scheduled the estate sale for the following weekend. "No point letting the house sit empty," he announced at the post-funeral gathering, his realtor instincts taking over. "The sooner we clear everything out, the sooner we can get it on the market. That neighborhood's really up and coming, especially with all the new development happening on the east side." Jess nodded enthusiastically, already envisioning her share of the property sale. "Frank Kowalski runs the best estate sale company in western North Carolina," she said, scrolling through her phone to find his contact information. "He'll handle everything professionally, get top dollar for the antiques and jewelry. We should be able to clear at least $40,000 from the contents alone." I sat in Grandma Maggie's kitchen chair, the same one where she'd listened to my library stories and asked thoughtful questions about my bookkeeping clients, feeling like my siblings were planning to auction off pieces of my heart. When I suggested maybe we should take more time to go through her belongings carefully, Bobby gave me that patient look he used with difficult clients. "Sarah, I know this is emotional, but we need to be practical," he said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that had made him successful in real estate negotiations. "None of us has the space or time to sort through decades of accumulated stuff. Frank's team will identify anything truly valuable, and the rest can go to people who'll actually use it. Grandma wouldn't want her things gathering dust in storage units." The speed with which they moved forward left me feeling dizzy. Within days, Frank Kowalski and his team had descended on the house like professional vultures, efficiently cataloging and pricing everything from Grandma Maggie's jewelry box to her kitchen appliance. I watched them handle her possessions with the detached competence of people who saw dollar signs instead of memories, and something deep in my chest started aching in a way that had nothing to do with greed. Bobby and Jess arrived early on the day before the sale to claim their picks from the valuable items. Bobby went straight for the antique furniture, loading his SUV with a mahogany dining set and grandfather clock that Frank had appraised at several $1,000s. Jess focused on the jewelry and decorative pieces, wrapping Grandma Maggie's pearl necklaces and silver serving sets in tissue paper while chatting excitedly about how they'd look in her Atlanta apartment. "Sarah, you should grab something nice while you can," Jess said, holding up a pair of vintage earrings. "Once the sale starts tomorrow, the good stuff will go fast to dealers and collectors." I wandered through the house that had been my sanctuary for over 20 years, watching strangers price tag the rocking chair where Grandma Maggie had read me bedtime stories and the kitchen table where she'd helped me with homework. Everything familiar was being transformed into inventory, and I felt like I was losing her all over again. "What about the basement?" I asked Frank, as he checked items off his clipboard. "There's a whole workshop down there," he waved dismissively, "mostly junk, from what I could see. Old paint cans, craft supplies, broken furniture. We'll add it to the bulk lots for the bargain hunters. Your grandmother seems to have been quite the pack rat down there." The casual dismissal stung. Grandma Maggie's workshop, the place where she'd spent countless hours on mysterious projects that made her eyes light up with excitement, reduced to junk by someone who'd never even met her. I started to protest, but Bobby interrupted. "Actually, Sarah, since you're not working full-time, maybe you could handle cleaning out the basement and attic after the sale," he suggested in the tone of someone offering a favor. "Jess and I will split the proceeds from the main items, and you can have whatever's left in the basement or trade for your time." Jess nodded eagerly. "That works perfectly. Sarah's always been good at organizing, and honestly, someone needs to clear out all that old stuff before we can show the house to potential buyers." The dismissive way they spoke about Grandma Maggie's workshop, as if her private creative space was just an inconvenient cleanup job, made my hands clench into fists. But this was the familiar family dynamic, the one where Bobby and Jess took charge while I handled the unglamorous detail. I heard myself agreeing, partly because I couldn't bear the thought of strangers pawing through her workshop, and partly because some instinct told me I needed to be the one to go through her things carefully. That evening, as Bobby and Jess celebrated their successful pre-shopping over dinner at Grove Park Inn, I returned to the empty house with my key. The silence felt different now, expectant somehow, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I made my way down to the basement, switching on the single overhead bulb that cast harsh shadows across Grandma Maggie's workshop. Frank was right that it looked like chaos to an untrained eye. Tables covered with paint tubes, brushes, magnifying glasses, and what appeared to be restoration supplies. Shelves lined with art books, local history guides, and dozens of notebooks filled with her careful handwriting. Canvases leaning against walls, some blank, others covered with color samples and test strokes. But as I moved closer, I began to see organization in the apparent disorder. The books were arranged by topic and time period. The notebooks were numbered and dated. The restoration supplies were professional grade, the kind used by museums and serious collectors. This wasn't the hobby workshop of an elderly woman killing time. This was the laboratory of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I picked up one of the notebooks, its pages filled with detailed notes about paint composition, aging techniques, and authentication methods. Another contained sketches of artwork with careful measurements and condition assessment. A third was filled with names, dates, and what appeared to be purchase records going back decades. My hands started trembling as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't a collection of random craft projects. This was documentation of a serious art collection, meticulously maintained and preserved by someone with expertise I'd never suspected Grandma Maggie possessed. Remembering her final words about treasures being behind the stories, I started pulling art books from the shelves, looking for anything that might explain what she'd been trying to tell me. Most were standard reference guides, but several had pages marked with small paper flags, passages highlighted in faded yellow marker. One section particularly caught my attention, dealing with regional folk art movements in Appalachian communities during the mid-20th century. Grandma Maggie had made extensive notes in the margins, cross-referencing names and dates with her numbered notebooks. As I compared her handwritten records with the academic text, a stunning possibility began to emerge. According to her notes, she hadn't just been interested in regional art history, she'd been actively involved in it, purchasing works directly from struggling artists during the economic hardships of the night. The notebook entries detailed dozens of transactions, each carefully documented with the artist's name, the work's description, the purchase price and its storage location. My heart was pounding as I followed her documentation system, cross-referencing notebook entries with marked passages in the art books. If her records were accurate, she'd accumulated a significant collection of works by artists who were now recognized as important regional figures. But where was the actual artwork? I spent the next 2 hours systematically searching the basement, following Grandma Maggie's cryptic references to storage locations. Behind the furnace, I found several flat wooden crates, each labeled with numbers that corresponded to her notebook. Inside were paintings wrapped in acid-free tissue, exactly the way professional collectors preserve valuable artwork. As I carefully unwrapped the first piece, my breath caught in my throat. It was a landscape painting of the Blue Ridge Mountains, signed by an artist whose name I recognized from the art history books upstairs. According to Grandma Maggie's notes, she'd bought it directly from the artist in 1963 for $25, helping him pay for groceries during a particularly difficult winter. The second crate contained portraits of local mountain families, painted with a raw emotional honesty that made my chest ache. These weren't amateur weekend paint. They were sophisticated works by artists who'd captured something essential about Appalachian life during a period of profound cultural change. By the time I'd worked through 6 crates, I was sitting on the concrete floor surrounded by what I was beginning to understand might be an extraordinary collection of regional art. But it was the 7th crate that took my breath away completely. Inside, wrapped with particular care, were 3 paintings signed by an artist I definitely recognized. Even with my limited art knowledge, I knew this name from museum exhibitions and auction records. According to Grandma Maggie's notes, she'd not only purchased these works directly from the artist, but had provided him with materials and studio space during a residency in Asheville during the summer of 19. The notebook entry for that summer was longer than most, describing how the artist had been documenting the changing mountain culture before it disappears entirely. Grandma Maggie had apparently served as both patron and guide, introducing him to local families and providing insights into traditional crafts and customs that informed his work. As I sat in that basement surrounded by decades of hidden treasures, I began to understand that my grandmother hadn't been the simple, sweet woman everyone thought they knew. She'd been a sophisticated art collector and cultural preservationist, quietly building a collection that documented a crucial period in Appalachian history, while supporting struggling artists with both financial help and deep cultural knowledge. The real treasures behind the stories weren't just the paintings themselves, they were the stories of how she'd acquired them, the relationships she'd built with artists, and the cultural history she'd helped preserve. Every piece in those crates represented not just aesthetic value but a human connection, a moment when her support had made the difference between an artist surviving or giving up. I thought about all the family gatherings where she'd tried to share her excitement about her projects, only to be politely dismissed or interrupted. I thought about Bobby and Jess upstairs, congratulating themselves on grabbing the valuable antiques, while planning to sell the house and contents as quickly as possible. They had no idea that the woman they'd buried yesterday had spent her life quietly assembling what might be one of the most important private collections of regional folk art in western North Carolina. But even as excitement coursed through me, I felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. What was I supposed to do with this discovery? How could I possibly explain to Bobby and Jess that their eccentric grandmother had been hiding artwork worth potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in her basement workshop? How could I prove that these paintings were authentic when I could barely afford my rent, much less expensive authentication processes? And underneath those practical concerns was a deeper fear that had followed me through every family interaction for the past 20 years. What if I was wrong? What if I was seeing significance where none existed? Building up elaborate fantasies because I wanted so desperately for Grandma Maggie to have been more than everyone thought she was. What if I was just the delusional middle child, finding imaginary treasures because I couldn't accept that sometimes a basement workshop really was just a basement workshop? As I carefully rewrapped the paintings and returned them to their crates, I could hear David's voice in my head asking practical questions about authentication and market value. I could imagine Bobby's patient expression when I tried to explain why we should delay the estates. I could picture Jess's barely concealed eye roll when I suggested that maybe, just maybe, we'd all underestimated the woman who'd raised us. But as I climbed the basement stairs and turned off the light, leaving Grandma Maggie's secret collection in the darkness where it had waited patiently for decades, I knew I couldn't let this discovery disappear into Frank Kowalski's bulk lot sale. Whatever it took, however difficult the conversations ahead might be, I owed it to Grandma Maggie to find out the truth about what she'd spent her life building in that basement workshop. The estate sale was scheduled to begin in less than 12 hours, and I had until then to figure out how to save a collection that might represent not just my inheritance, but my grandmother's true legacy. Sleep refused to come that night. I lay in my narrow twin bed above Henderson's used books, staring at the ceiling while car headlights swept across the walls and created moving shadows that reminded me of the way light had played across those hidden paintings in Grandma Maggie's basement. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face during those final weeks, the way she'd clutch my hand and insist that everything needed to be documented properly. The weight of what I'd discovered pressed down on me like a physical thing. In less than 8 hours, strangers would be walking through that house, pawing through items that Frank Kowalski had dismissed as worthless craft supplies and old paint cans. Meanwhile, Bobby and Jess were probably sleeping peacefully in their hotel rooms, satisfied with their successful pre-sale shopping and confident that they'd claimed everything of value. I kept thinking about the summer of 1968 entry in Grandma Maggie's notebook, the one where she described providing studio space and cultural guidance to that well-known artist. The way she'd written about documenting the changing mountain culture suggested she understood something profound was happening, something worth preserving for future generations. But she'd never mentioned any of this to us, never hinted that she was anything more than a widow who took in sewing to make ends meet. Rolling over, I grabbed my laptop from the nightstand and started researching the artists whose names appeared in her carefully maintained record. What I found made my stomach flutter with nervous excitement. Several were now represented in major museum collections. Others had works selling at regional galleries for thousands of dollars. A few had pieces that had appeared at auction houses with estimates that made me dizzy. But it was the biographical information that really captured my attention. Artist after artist had stories of struggling during the economic hardships of the 1950s and 1960s, of being supported by anonymous patrons or community members who believed in their work when no one else did. Reading between the lines of gallery biographies and exhibition catalogs, I began to see traces of Grandma Maggie's influence everywhere. One artist's biography mentioned crucial support from a local seamstress who understood the cultural significance of documenting traditional mountain craft. Another credited an Asheville patron who provided both financial assistance and deep knowledge of regional history. A third described how a generous community member offered studio space and introductions to local families during a pivotal residency period. The more I researched, the more I realized that Grandma Maggie hadn't just been collecting art randomly. She'd been systematically supporting artists who were documenting Appalachian culture during a period of rapid change. The interstate highway system was bringing new development to the mountains. Traditional crafts and customs were disappearing as younger generations moved to cities for work. She'd apparently recognized that something important was being lost and had quietly worked to ensure it would be preserved. By 3 in the morning, I'd filled a notebook with cross-references between her collection records and current market values. Even conservative estimates suggested the basement workshop contained artwork worth several $100,000. But the real value seemed to be cultural and historical. This wasn't just a private art collection. It was a documented archive of a specific time and place, assembled by someone with deep personal knowledge of the community and artists involved. I thought about all the times she'd tried to share her excitement about her projects, only to be politely ignored or dismissed. How many family dinners had she sat quietly while Bobby dominated conversations with real estate success stories and Jess described her latest marketing campaign? How many times had she started to mention something interesting she was working on, only to be interrupted or redirected to more practical topics? The realization that we'd essentially silenced her for years made me feel sick. She'd been doing something remarkable, something that connected her to artists and cultural movements that extended far beyond our small family circle. But because none of us had bothered to really listen or ask meaningful questions, she'd eventually stopped trying to share what clearly meant everything to her. I remembered a particular Christmas dinner when she'd mentioned meeting someone interesting at the local arts council, how excited she'd seemed about a project involving preserving mountain tradition. Bobby had immediately launched into a story about flipping a historic property, and Jess had started talking about her company's new campaign for a tourism board. Grandma Maggie had gone quiet, but I'd caught her watching me with that same look she'd had in the hospital, like she was trying to communicate something important without words. Now I understood what she'd been trying to tell me. The Arts Council connection, the preservation projects, the careful documentation system in her notebooks. She hadn't been randomly collecting pretty pictures. She'd been part of a larger movement to document and preserve Appalachian culture, working with established cultural organizations and serious artists to create something lasting and important. But understanding the significance of her work also made me realize how completely unprepared I was to handle this discovery.
I was a part-time librarian and bookkeeper who lived in a studio apartment and drove a 7-year-old Honda. I didn't know anything about art authentication, insurance, or the legal complexities of managing a collection this valuable. I didn't have connections in the art world or the financial resources to properly care for works that clearly needed climate-controlled storage and professional conservation. Worse, I could already imagine the family reaction when I tried to explain what I'd found. Bobby would want independent appraisals and immediate liquidation. Jess would start calculating her share of the proceeds and probably suggest we donate pieces for tax advantages. Neither of them would understand or care about Grandma Maggie's deeper purpose in building this collection. They'd see dollar signs where she'd seen cultural preservation. As dawn light started filtering through my small window, I realized I was facing the same choice that had defined every major decision in my adult life. I could take the safe path, the one that wouldn't upset family dynamics or require me to step outside my comfortable but limited role. I could mention the paintings casually, let Bobby and Jess take over the complex business of authentication and sale, and accept whatever small percentage they deemed appropriate for my discovery. Or I could honor what Grandma Maggie had been trying to tell me during those final weeks. I could take seriously her insistence that the real treasures were behind the stories and that everything needed to be properly documented. I could try to understand not just the monetary value of what she'd collected, but the cultural mission that had driven her to spend decades quietly supporting struggling artists and preserving disappearing tradition. The problem was that the second path would require me to become someone I'd never been before. Someone who spoke up in family meetings instead of staying quiet. Someone who asked hard questions and demanded real answers instead of accepting whatever Bobby and Jess decided was best. Someone who believed that maybe, just maybe, the quiet middle child might actually understand something important that the successful siblings had missed. By the time I heard the first cars pulling into the estate sale, I still hadn't decided which version of myself I was going to be that day. Part 3. The disruption. The morning of the estate sale dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that made everything look tired and shabby. I arrived at Grandma Maggie's house to find Frank Kowalski's team already setting up tables in the front yard, covering them with plastic sheeting to protect the merchandise from the light rain. Even from the street I could see Bobby's mahogany dining set prominently displayed under a tent, price tags fluttering in the morning breeze like tiny flags of surrender. Cars were already circling the block, early bird shoppers and professional dealers scoping out the competition before the official 9 o'clock start time. I recognized several faces from other estate sales I'd attended over the years, the regulars who knew how to spot valuable items quickly and weren't afraid to elbow their way to the best pieces when the doors opened. Bobby and Jess were standing near the registration table looking polished and professional in their coordinating navy jackets, clipboards in hand as they consulted with Frank about pricing strategies and payment procedures. They'd positioned themselves as the competent executors of the estate, the responsible family members who understood how to handle business efficiently and profitably. Frank spotted me approaching and waved me over with the casual friendliness of someone who'd already written me off as irrelevant to the day's proceedings. "Sarah, good, you're here. I've got the basement and attic areas cordoned off for now, but once we get the main sale moving, you can start your cleanup project down there. Probably take you most of the weekend to sort through everything and get it ready for donation pickup." The dismissive assumption that I'd spend my days hauling junk to donation centers while they handled the profitable aspects of the sale made my jaw clench. But before I could respond, Bobby stepped in with his practiced real estate agent charm. "We really appreciate you taking care of the tedious stuff, Sarah," he said, his tone suggesting he was doing me a favor by letting me handle the unwanted cleanup work. "Jess and I will manage the financial aspects and coordinate with Frank's team. You know how you are with details and organization, so the basement project is perfect for you." Jess nodded enthusiastically, already scrolling through her phone to check the weather forecast and calculate optimal timing for posting social media updates about the sale. "Honestly, it works out perfectly. Bobby and I understand the business side of estate management, and you're so good at the behind-the-scenes work that nobody else wants to do." The casual way they'd assigned me to cleanup duty while positioning themselves as the financial decision-makers felt like every family dynamic I'd ever experienced, but amplified and made official. They weren't just dismissing my input, they were systematically excluding me from any meaningful involvement in decisions about Grandma Maggie's legacy. At exactly 9 o'clock,
Frank lifted the rope barrier and announced that the sale was officially open. The waiting crowd surged forward with the focused intensity of people who'd been strategizing their purchases for hours. Within minutes, the front yard was packed with browsers examining everything from kitchen appliances to jewelry, their conversations creating a buzz of commercial activity that made the whole scene feel like a carnival where Grandma Maggie's life was being auctioned off to the highest bidder. I watched from the front porch as strangers handled her belongings with the casual efficiency of experienced shoppers. A woman in designer sunglasses picked up the ceramic coffee mug Grandma Maggie had used every morning for 20 years, examined it briefly for chips or cracks, then set it back down when she decided it wasn't worth the $3 asking price. A man in a flannel shirt tested the stability of her favorite rocking chair, the one where she'd sat every evening watching the sunset through the living room window, then moved on when someone else grabbed a lamp he'd been considering. Bobby moved through the crowd like a politician working a room, shaking hands with serious-looking dealers and answering questions about provenance and condition, with the smooth confidence of someone who'd never doubted his authority to speak for the family. Jess stationed herself near the jewelry table, keeping careful watch over the pieces Frank had identified as most valuable while taking photos for her social media followers. Getting some amazing pieces from Grandma's collection, she posted on Instagram, along with a picture of herself holding up a vintage brooch. So grateful for family treasures that connect us to our history. The irony of her talking about connecting to family history while systematically selling off everything Grandma Maggie had cared about was almost too much to bear. But what really made my stomach churn was watching people walk past the basement door without a second glance, completely unaware that the most significant part of the estate was hidden just steps away from where they were examining mass-produced kitchen gadgets and outdated electronics. By mid-morning, the sale was generating exactly the kind of efficient commercial activity Frank had promised. The mahogany furniture Bobby had claimed was attracting serious interest from antique dealers. Jess's jewelry selections were moving steadily to collectors who appreciated vintage pieces. Even the bulk household items were selling to bargain hunters who saw value in Grandma Maggie's practical accumulation. But as I watched the systematic dismantling of everything visible and obvious, I kept thinking about those carefully wrapped paintings in the basement, the detailed documentation in her notebooks, and the decades of quiet cultural preservation work that nobody knew existed. Every sale transaction felt like another piece of her real legacy disappearing before anyone understood what was actually being lost. Around noon, when the initial crowd had thinned out and the most obvious treasures had been claimed, I made my way down to the basement under the pretense of beginning my assigned cleanup work. Frank had left the area largely unsupervised, confident that anything valuable would have been identified during his initial assessment. The harsh overhead light made everything look even more chaotic than it had the night before, but I could see past the surface disorder to the careful organization underneath. I spent the next hour systematically photographing everything with my phone, documenting not just the artwork itself but Grandma Maggie's storage system, her detailed notebooks and the professional quality restoration supplies that suggested serious expertise rather than casual hobby work. Each image felt like evidence in a case I was building, though I wasn't sure yet what I planned to do with the documentation. The sound of footsteps on the basement stairs interrupted my photography session. I looked up to see David descending, his expression mixing curiosity with the familiar impatience he showed when he thought I was wasting time on impractical projects. "Bobby said you were down here cleaning out old junk," he said, glancing around the workshop with obvious skepticism. "How long is this going to take? I thought we could grab lunch and maybe look at that condo listing I mentioned." The casual assumption that my grandmother's lifework was old junk that needed to be efficiently disposed of so we could move on to more important things like real estate shopping made something snap inside me. For the first time in our 2-year relationship, I felt genuinely angry at David rather than just quietly frustrated. "This isn't junk," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "This is a carefully maintained art collection that's been preserved down here for decades." David picked up one of the notebooks, flipped through a few pages of Grandma Maggie's detailed documentation, then set it down with the patronizing smile he used when he thought I was being naive about practical matters. "Sarah, I know this is emotional for you, but you can't let sentiment cloud your judgment," he said in the same tone he might use to explain basic accounting principles to a confused client. "These are just some old paintings and craft supplies. Your grandmother was probably doing art therapy or keeping busy with hobby projects. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not the same thing as having valuable artwork." The complete dismissal of everything I'd discovered, combined with his assumption that I was too emotional and sentimental to assess the situation rationally, felt like every conversation we'd ever had about my career choices, my living situation, and my apparent inability to maximize my potential. He wasn't just dismissing Grandma Maggie's collection, he was dismissing me. Have you looked at any of this documentation? I asked, holding up one of her notebooks filled with detailed provenance records and cross-references to established art historical sources. Do you see the professional supplies she was using? The climate-controlled storage system, the way everything is cataloged and preserved. David glanced around the basement again, but I could tell he was seeing the same cluttered workshop Frank Kowalski had dismissed, rather than the sophisticated preservation operation I was trying to show him. His expression shifted to the patient concern he typically reserved for elderly relatives who needed gentle redirection away from unrealistic ideas. Look, I know you want this to be something special, he said, moving closer and lowering his voice as if speaking to someone who needed careful handling. But you're a librarian, not an art expert. You don't have the training to evaluate these kinds of things. Why don't you let Bobby handle the appraisal process? He has connections with people who actually know about valuable collections. The suggestion that I should defer to Bobby's expertise, that I was fundamentally unqualified to understand what I'd discovered in my own grandmother's house, crystallized every doubt and insecurity that had been building since childhood. David wasn't just questioning my assessment of the art collection, he was questioning my right to have opinions about anything important, my ability to recognize value that others had missed, my credibility as someone whose insights might actually matter. Part 4. The revelation. By mid-afternoon, the estate sale had reached that frenzied peak where serious buyers were making final decisions, and casual browsers were looking for last-minute bargains. The front yard had been transformed into a marketplace where decades of Grandma Maggie's life were being efficiently converted into cash transactions. I watched from the kitchen window as Frank tallied sales figures with the satisfied expression of someone whose professional reputation was being enhanced by strong revenue numbers. Bobby was in his element, networking with dealers and collectors who saw him as the authoritative family representative. He'd positioned himself as the estate's primary contact person, the one who could answer questions about provenance and make decisions about pricing negotiation. Several times I'd seen him gesture toward the house while explaining family history to potential buyers, always presenting himself as the grandson who'd been closest to Grandma Maggie and most familiar with her belongings. Jess had spent the morning documenting her successful acquisitions on social media, posting pictures of herself with various pieces while describing them as meaningful family heirlooms and precious connections to our heritage. Her followers were responding with envious comments about her good fortune in inheriting such beautiful vintage items, completely unaware that she'd cherry-picked the most obviously valuable pieces before the sale even began. But what bothered me most was the systematic way they'd excluded me from any meaningful involvement in decisions about Grandma Maggie's legacy. When dealers asked about the history of particular items, Bobby answered without consulting me, despite the fact that I'd spent more time in this house over the past 2 years than both my siblings combined. When Frank had questions about family preferences for handling unsold items, he directed them to Jess, apparently assuming that the successful marketing executive was more qualified to make such decisions than the part-time librarian. The message was clear. Bobby and Jess were the competent adults who understood how to manage valuable assets and complex business transactions. I was the helpful but limited family member who could be trusted with cleanup work but shouldn't be involved in important decisions. It was the same dynamic that had shaped every family interaction since childhood, but now it was being applied to the final dismantling of the woman who'd raised us. Standing in that kitchen where Grandma Maggie had listened to my stories about library patrons and bookkeeping clients, where she'd always made me feel like my work mattered and my insights had value, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The quiet acceptance that had characterized my response to family dynamics for 34 years was being replaced by something sharper and more determined. I made my way back down to the basement, ostensibly to continue my assigned cleanup work, but actually to take one final careful look at what I'd discovered. The paintings were still there in their protective crates, the notebooks still filled with detailed documentation, the professional restoration supplies, still arranged with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. This time I focused on the authentication elements I'd missed during my initial excitement about the discovery. Grandma Maggie hadn't just collected artwork, she'd documented every piece with the thoroughness of a professional curator. Each painting had detailed condition reports, photographic documentation of signatures and unique markings, and provenance records that traced the work's history from creation to acquisition. More importantly, she'd maintained correspondence files with galleries, museums, and other collectors that revealed the extent of her connections within the regional art community. Letters from gallery directors thanked her for valuable insights into local artistic tradition. Museum curators sought her advice about authenticating works by artists she'd known personally, Academic researchers cited her as a source in papers about Appalachian cultural movement. The picture that emerged was of someone who'd been quietly recognized as an expert within professional circles, even while being dismissed as a hobbyist by her own family. She'd served on arts council committees, consulted with exhibition organizers, and provided authentication services for other collectors. The eccentric puttering in her basement workshop had actually been sophisticated cultural preservation work that connected her to institutions and experts across the Southeast. But it was the letter I found in the final notebook that stopped me cold. Written in Grandma Maggie's careful handwriting and dated just 3 months before her death, it was addressed to me. "My dear Sarah," it began, "if you're reading this, then you've found what I've been trying to show you for years. I know the others think I'm just an old woman with too much time on her hands, but you've always listened differently. You've always seen value in things that others overlook, whether it's helping that struggling business owner with her books, or finding the perfect story for a lonely library patron." The letter continued for 3 pages, explaining how she'd recognized my ability to see significance in details that others missed, how she'd watched me develop the same instincts for cultural preservation that had driven her own collecting work. She described choosing me as the inheritor of her collection not because I was the family member with the most obvious qualifications, but because I was the one who understood that some things mattered more than their immediate market value. "You have the heart of a preservationist, Sarah," she wrote. "You understand that stories and objects and traditions need someone to care for them, not just someone to profit from them. I trust you to continue what I started, not because you have the most money or the most connections, but because you have the patience to listen to what these pieces are trying to tell us about who we are and where we came from." The final paragraph made my hands tremble as I read. "I've left detailed instructions with my lawyer about the collection's legal status. Everything in the basement workshop is yours alone, not part of the general estate. I've also established a small fund to help with initial authentication and preservation costs. Don't let them convince you that this work doesn't matter, or that you're not qualified to continue it. You're the only one who ever really listened when I tried to explain why it was important." I set the letter down carefully, my mind racing through the implications of what she'd revealed. If the collection legally belonged to me alone, then Bobby and Jess's assumption that they could make decisions about its disposal was completely wrong. More importantly, Grandma Maggie had apparently anticipated exactly the family dynamics that were playing out upstairs, where my siblings claimed authority over decisions while dismissing my input as irrelevant. But even with legal ownership established, I still faced the practical challenge of what to do with a collection I was completely unprepared to manage. The authentication processes alone would require expertise and resources I didn't possess. The insurance and storage requirements would be beyond my current financial means, and the family conflict that would inevitably result from asserting my rights to the collection would test relationships that were already strained by Bobby and Jess's assumption that they deserved the most valuable parts of the inheritance. The sound of voices upstairs reminded me that the estate sale was still in progress, that every minute I spent in the basement was another minute that Grandma Maggie's life was being converted into other people's bargains and treasure. But now I understood that the real estate sale had never been about her life at all. It had been about the visible, obvious things that could be quickly converted into cash and divided among family members who'd never bothered to understand what she actually cared about. The collection in the basement represented everything Bobby and Jess had missed about the woman who'd raised us. It was evidence of intellectual curiosity they'd never recognized, professional expertise they'd never acknowledged, and cultural preservation work they'd never valued. Most importantly, it was proof that Grandma Maggie had seen something in me that I'd never seen in myself, something that made her trust me with the most important work of her life. As I carefully returned her letter to its place in the notebook, I realized I was facing the most significant decision of my adult life. I could continue playing the role of helpful but limited family member, mentioning the collection casually and letting Bobby and Jess take over the complex business of managing valuable assets. I could accept their assumption that I wasn't qualified to handle important decisions, and defer to their superior business expertise. Or I could honor what Grandma Maggie had been trying to tell me for years, what she'd finally made explicit in that letter. I could trust that maybe she'd seen something real in my ability to recognize value that others overlooked, to care for things that needed preserving rather than just profiting. I could believe that the skills I'd developed listening to library patrons and helping small business owners might actually translate into something more significant than anyone had ever imagined. The choice felt enormous, but it also felt inevitable. Upstairs, Bobby and Jess were efficiently disposing of everything they could see and measure and price. Down in the basement, Grandma Maggie's real legacy waited for someone who understood that some treasures could only be found by people who knew how to look behind the obvious stories to find the deeper truths underneath. Part 5. The Isolation. The confrontation began at dinner that evening, After Frank's team had finished packing up unsold items and calculating final sales figure, Bobby had suggested we celebrate the successful sale at Grove Park Inn, the kind of upscale restaurant choice that always made me feel underdressed and out of place. Jess had immediately agreed, already calculating how the evening would look on her social media feeds and what kind of image it would project about our family's sophisticated approach to estate management. I'd spent the afternoon after my basement discovery in a state of nervous energy, Grandma Maggie's letter folded carefully in my purse while I tried to figure out how to broach the subject of the hidden collection. Every scenario I imagined ended with Bobby and Jess dismissing my claims as emotional fantasy or naive misartune. I could already hear Bobby's patient explanations about why I wasn't qualified to evaluate valuable artwork. Already see Jess's barely concealed eye rolls when I tried to describe authentication documentation and provenance record. But as we sat in the restaurant's elegant dining room, surrounded by the kind of affluent clientele that Bobby and Jess navigated effortlessly, listening to them celebrate the day's profits while planning the quick sale of the house, I felt something crystallize inside me. They were talking about Grandma Maggie's legacy as if it were nothing more than a successful business transaction, congratulating themselves on their efficient management of what they saw as a routine estate liquidation. Frank thinks we can have the house on the market within 2 weeks, Bobby was saying, cutting into his steak with the satisfied precision of someone whose day had exceeded expectation. The location is perfect for young professionals who want that historic neighborhood charm but close enough to downtown for easy commuting. We should see multiple offers within the first month. Jess nodded enthusiastically, scrolling through her phone to show us comparable sales in the area. Honestly, the timing couldn't be better. The market is absolutely insane right now, especially for properties with character. We'll probably get 20% over asking. Maybe more if we stage it right and target the right demographic. They discussed square footage and market comparisons with the casual expertise of people who'd reduced Grandma Maggie's home to a commodity, just another asset to be optimized and monetized. Neither of them mentioned the decades she'd spent in that house, the memories created in those rooms, or the possibility that it might contain anything worth preserving beyond its real estate value. What about the basement? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual despite the way my heart was racing. Did Frank finish evaluating everything down there? Bobby waved dismissively, already reaching for his wine glass. Mostly junk like we expected. Some old paint supplies, craft materials, boxes of paper. Frank said it would cost more to haul away than any of it was worth. That's why we figured you could handle the cleanup, maybe donate whatever's salvageable and dump the rest. The casual dismissal of everything I'd discovered, the assumption that decades of careful documentation and professionally preserved artwork were just junk to be dumped or donated, made my hands clench under the table. But what really stung was the way they'd made unilateral decisions about disposal without even asking what I'd found during my preliminary sorting. Actually, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded, I think you might want to take another look at what's down there. Some of it might be more valuable than Frank realized. Jess looked up from her phone with the polite interest she typically showed when I mentioned something work-related that she didn't consider particularly important. Oh, did you find some vintage kitchen stuff? I saw a few pieces that might be worth something to collectors who are into that mid-century aesthetic. Not kitchen items, I said, pulling Grandma Maggie's letter from my purse. Art, paintings, actually, and documentation that suggests they might be quite valuable. The change in atmosphere was immediate and unmistakable. Bobby's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and Jess set down her phone with sudden, focused attention. But instead of curiosity or excitement, their expressions showed the kind of skeptical concern that adults use when dealing with a child who's clearly confused about something important. Sarah, Bobby said in the patient tone he used for difficult real estate clients, we've all been through that basement multiple times. Frank's team did a complete inventory. If there was valuable artwork down there, don't you think professionals would have identified? I spread Grandma Maggie's letter on the table, along with photocopies of several notebook pages that documented specific pieces and their authentication details. She left me a letter explaining everything. The collection was kept separate from the general estate. It legally belongs to me, not to the family trust. The silence that followed felt dense and uncomfortable. Jess picked up one of the notebook pages, scanning Grandma Maggie's careful documentation with an expression that shifted from skepticism to something harder to read. Bobby reached for the letter, his jaw tightening as he read through her explanation of the collection's significance and her reasons for choosing me as its inheritor.
This is, Bobby started, then stopped, apparently struggling to find words that would express his reaction without sounding directly insulting. Sarah, I think you're misunderstanding what Grandma was trying to tell you. She was elderly, probably confused about values and authentication. These notebooks could be about anything, hobby projects or craft fair purchases. Jess was photographing the notebook pages with her phone, her expression calculating in a way that made my stomach tighten. "We need to have this properly evaluated by experts," she said, her marketing background clearly kicking in as she shifted into problem-solving mode. "If there's actually valuable artwork involved, we can't make decisions based on an elderly woman's possibly confused documentation." The casual dismissal of Grandma Maggie's expertise, the assumption that her careful documentation was the product of confusion rather than decades of sophisticated cultural preservation work, made something snap inside me. These were the same siblings who'd never bothered to ask meaningful questions about her interests, who'd dismissed her excitement about her projects as eccentric puttering, who'd reduced her life's work to clean up tasks that could be handled by the family member they considered least qualified to manage important decisions. "She wasn't confused," I said, my voice louder than I'd intended. "She was connected to galleries and museums across the Southeast. She consulted with curators and researchers. She served on arts council committees. You never bothered to find out what she was actually doing because you assumed someone who lived simply couldn't be doing anything sophisticated." Bobby's expression shifted to the kind of controlled patience he used when negotiations got heated and someone needed to be the reasonable adult in the room. "Look, we're all emotional about losing Grandma, but we can't let sentiment cloud our judgment about practical matters. If you really think there's valuable artwork in that basement, we'll bring in professional appraisers. But we need to handle this through the proper estate channels, not make assumptions based on letters written by someone who might not have understood current market values." The suggestion that any valuable discoveries should be handled through proper estate channels rather than according to Grandma Maggie's specific legal instructions made it clear that Bobby had no intention of accepting her decision to leave the collection to me alone. He was already positioning himself as the responsible family representative who would ensure that valuable assets were properly managed and fairly distributed. Jess was scrolling through her phone, apparently researching art appraisal services while we talked. "There's a firm in Charlotte that specializes in estate art evaluation," she said, already taking charge of the logistics in the same way she'd managed the estate sale coordination. "We can have them out next week to do a proper assessment. Then we'll know what we're actually dealing with." The assumption that we would be making decisions about my inheritance, that Bobby and Jess would naturally take charge of managing whatever turned out to be valuable, crystallized everything that had been building since the funeral. They weren't just dismissing Grandma Maggie's judgment about the collection's significance. They were dismissing her judgment about me, her decision to trust me with something she'd considered the most important work of her life. "It's not a family decision," I said, folding the letter carefully and returning it to my purse. "She left specific legal instructions. The collection belongs to me." The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Bobby and Jess exchanged the kind of look that had passed between them countless times during our childhood. The wordless communication of siblings who'd always seen themselves as allies against a third party who didn't quite understand how things worked in the real world. "Sarah," Jess said, her voice taking on the gentle firmness she probably used with confused clients, "you're a part-time librarian who lives in a studio apartment. Even if there is valuable artwork involved, you don't have the resources or expertise to manage that kind of responsibility. It wouldn't be fair to you or to Grandma's memory to let you struggle with something you're not equipped to handle." The suggestion that inheriting valuable artwork would be an unfair burden rather than a meaningful legacy, that I should be grateful to be relieved of responsibilities I wasn't equipped to handle, felt like every conversation we'd ever had about my career choices, my living situation, and my apparent inability to achieve the kind of success they'd found in their professional life. But this time, instead of the familiar knot of inadequacy and self-doubt, I felt something clearer and stronger. Grandma Maggie had seen something in me that my siblings couldn't recognize, something that made her trust me with decades of cultural preservation work that had connected her to institutions and experts across the region. She'd made a deliberate choice about who should continue that work, and it wasn't the real estate agent with the business connections or the marketing executive with the organizational expertise. "You're right," I said, standing up from the table and reaching for my jacket. "I don't have your resources or your professional connections, but I have something you've never had." I listened to her. I paid attention when she tried to share what she was working on. I understood that her work mattered, even when you dismissed it as eccentric hobby project. Bobby was already reaching for his wallet, his expression shifting to the kind of controlled frustration he showed when clients became unreasonable about property values or contract terms. "Let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be. We'll get professional evaluations,
work with the lawyer to clarify the legal issues, and make sure everyone's interests are protected. There's no reason this has to become a family conflict. But as I walked out of that restaurant, leaving Bobby and Jess to finish their celebration dinner and plan their coordinated response to my unexpected assertions, I realized that the conflict had been building for decades. Every time they'd interrupted Grandma Maggie when she tried to share her excitement about her projects, the drive back to my apartment that night felt like traveling through a different world than the one I'd inhabited that morning. The familiar streets of downtown Asheville looked strange under the streetlights, as if discovering Grandma Maggie's collection had shifted something fundamental about how I saw everything around me. I kept thinking about the way Bobby and Jess had looked at each other when I mentioned the legal separation of the collection from the general estate. That wordless communication that said they'd handle this the same way they'd handled every family situation that didn't fit their expectations. My studio apartment felt impossibly small when I climbed the narrow stairs above Henderson's used books. The space that had seemed cozy and sufficient that morning now felt cramped and inadequate, like I was trying to contain something too large for the boundaries I'd built around my life. I sat on my narrow bed, Grandma Maggie's letter spread out beside me, and tried to process the magnitude of what she'd entrusted to me. The phone started ringing around 10 o'clock. First Bobby, his voice carefully controlled as he suggested we needed to have a calm, rational discussion about the situation I'd raised at dinner. Then Jess, offering to help me research art authentication services and suggesting we could work together to maximize the value of whatever I'd found. Both conversations carried the same underlying message. I was clearly overwhelmed by discoveries I wasn't qualified to handle, and the responsible thing would be to let them take charge of decisions that required real expertise. I turned off my phone after the third call from Bobby, but I could imagine the strategy session happening in his hotel room. They'd be treating this like any other business challenge, identifying stakeholders and potential obstacles while developing a plan to manage a situation that had become more complicated than they'd anticipated. The fact that the situation involved my inheritance of something Grandma Maggie had specifically chosen to leave to me would be just another variable to be managed through proper channels and professional consultation. David showed up around 11, using his spare key to let himself into the apartment with the assumption that we'd discuss this development rationally and reach sensible conclusions about next steps. He found me sitting on the floor surrounded by photocopies of Grandma Maggie's documentation, trying to understand the scope of what she'd assembled over decades of quiet collecting. "Bobby called me," he said, settling into my one comfortable chair with the expression of someone preparing to have a difficult but necessary conversation. "He's concerned that you're getting caught up in emotional thinking about some art supplies your grandmother left in her basement. He thinks you might need some objective perspective on the situation." The casual dismissal of everything I'd discovered, the assumption that my judgment was clouded by emotions while Bobby's was based on rational analysis, felt like every conversation David and I had ever had about my career choices or financial decisions. He saw himself as the practical voice of reason helping me navigate situations I was too sentimental to handle effectively. "Did Bobby mention that the collection legally belongs to me?" I asked, spreading out copies of Grandma Maggie's authentication, or that she left detailed provenance records for pieces that appeared to be by established regional artists. David picked up one of the notebook pages, scanning Grandma Maggie's careful handwriting with the same skeptical expression he'd shown in the basement. "Sarah, I know you want this to be something special, but you have to be realistic about what you're dealing with. Elderly people often overvalue things that have sentimental significance but no real market worth. Your grandmother probably paid $20 for some local paintings and convinced herself they were museum pieces." The suggestion that Grandma Maggie had been delusional about values, that her decades of careful documentation represented confused thinking rather than sophisticated expertise, made me feel something shift inside my chest. David wasn't just questioning my assessment of the collection. He was dismissing the possibility that the woman who'd raised me might have been more knowledgeable and capable than anyone in our family had ever recognized. "Have you looked at the professional supplies she was using?" I asked, pointing to my photographs of the climate-controlled storage system and conservation materials, or the correspondence files with galleries and museums. "This isn't someone who bought random paintings and made up stories about their importance." David set down the papers with the patient sigh he used when I persisted in impractical ideas despite his reasonable explanations. "Look, even if there are a few pieces with some value, you don't have the resources to handle authentication processes or proper insurance. The smart thing would be to work with Bobby and Jess to get professional evaluations and make informed decisions about liquidation. They have the business experience to handle these kinds of complex transactions." The assumption that I should automatically defer to my siblings' business expertise, that I was fundamentally unqualified to make decisions about my own inheritance, crystallized something that had been building since dinner. David wasn't offering to help me understand what I'd discovered or figure out how to honor Grandma Maggie's intentions. He was explaining why I should give up any claim to independent judgment and let more qualified people take over. What if I don't want to liquidate everything? What if I want to understand what she was trying to preserve and continue that work? The question seemed to genuinely surprise. David stared at me for a moment as if I'd suggested something completely irrational, like quitting my job to become a professional circus performer or using my savings to buy a boat. Continue what work? He asked, his voice taking on the careful tone people use with confused relatives. Sarah, she was an elderly woman who collected some paintings as a hobby. There's no work to continue. There's just a collection that needs to be properly valued and sold so you can use the money for practical things like paying off your student loans or maybe finally getting a decent car. The automatic assumption that any windfall should be immediately converted to cash and applied to practical concerns, that the idea of continuing Grandma Maggie's cultural preservation efforts was inherently unrealistic, made me understand something fundamental about David that I'd never wanted to acknowledge. He saw my life as a series of problems to be solved through better financial planning and more ambitious career choices. He'd never understood that I might have different priorities, that I might value things that couldn't be measured in terms of immediate practical benefit. She trusted me with this collection for a reason, I said, gathering up the scattered paper. Maybe I should try to understand what that reason was before I start planning how to convert everything to cash. David's expression shifted to something between frustration and genuine concern. You're talking like someone who's having an identity crisis because of grief. Your grandmother was a sweet woman who raised you after your parents died, but that doesn't mean she was an art expert or cultural historian. You're projecting significance onto her collection because you want to feel like there was more to her life than everyone realized. The suggestion that my recognition of Grandma Maggie's expertise was just grief-driven fantasy, that I was inventing importance to make myself feel better about her death, hit something raw and defensive inside me. David was essentially arguing that my judgment was so clouded by emotion that I couldn't accurately assess evidence that was documented in detailed records and supported by professional correspondence. Maybe you should read her letter, I said, handing him the pages where she'd explained her decades of work with regional artists and cultural institutions. Maybe you should look at the authentication documentation and provenance records before you decide that everything is emotional projection. David took the letter, but I could tell he was reading it with the same skeptical filter he'd applied to everything else. When he finished, his expression showed polite acknowledgement rather than the surprise or respect I'd hoped to see. It's a beautiful letter, he said, setting it down carefully. She obviously cared about you very much, but that doesn't change the practical realities of what you're dealing with. Even if some of these pieces have value, you don't have the expertise or resources to manage a collection properly. The responsible thing is to work with professionals who can help you liquidate the assets and use the proceeds wisely. The word liquidate hit me like a physical blow. David was talking about Grandma Maggie's life work the same way Bobby had discussed the house sale, as assets to be converted to cash as efficiently as possible. None of them could imagine that I might want to understand what she'd been trying to preserve, that I might feel obligated to continue work that had clearly meant everything to her. What if I'm not interested in being responsible in the way you think I should be? What if I want to take some risks to honor what she was trying to accomplish? The question seemed to catch David off guard. He looked around my small apartment as if taking inventory of all the ways my life failed to meet conventional standards of success, then back at me with an expression that mixed affection with genuine bewilderment. Sarah, I care about you, but I don't understand what's happening here, he said, his voice softening in a way that was probably meant to be reassuring. You're talking about abandoning practical considerations to pursue some kind of romantic fantasy about being an art preservation. You're a librarian who does part-time bookkeeping. You live in a studio apartment and drive a car that's held together with hope and determination. How exactly do you plan to manage a valuable art collection? The question forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding since discovering the collection. David was right that I had no practical experience with art authentication, climate-controlled storage, or insurance requirements for valuable cultural artifacts. I had no connections in the art world, no financial resources for conservation work, and no expertise in the complex legal and logistical challenges of managing a collection that might be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But as I looked around my small apartment, seeing it through David's eyes as evidence of my limited capabilities and practical failures, I also thought about Grandma Maggie's letter and her explanation for choosing me as the collection's inheritor. She hadn't picked me because I had obvious qualifications or impressive credentials. She'd chosen me because I'd listened when others dismissed her work, because I'd recognized value in things that couldn't be easily measured or quickly monetized. I don't know how I'll manage it, I admit, but I know I can't just sell everything without understanding what she was trying to accomplish. I owe it to her to at least try to figure out what this work meant and whether it's worth continuing. David stood up, his movement carrying the energy of someone who'd reached the limit of his patience with an unreasonable conversation. You don't owe anyone a romantic gesture that could destroy your financial security. You owe it to yourself to make smart decisions about a windfall that could actually improve your life in measurable ways. The phrase romantic gesture stung because it dismissed everything I was feeling as naive sentiment rather than legitimate obligation. David was essentially arguing that any choice that wasn't immediately practical was inherently foolish, that honoring Grandma Maggie's intentions was less important than converting her collection to cash that could solve my conventional problem. Maybe my life doesn't need improving in the ways you think it does, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. Maybe I'm not as dissatisfied with being a librarian and part-time bookkeeper as you think I should be. The comment seemed to hit David harder than I'd expected. His expression shifted to something that looked almost hurt, as if I'd attacked his efforts to help me rather than simply questioning his assumptions about what I needed. I've been trying to help you build something better for 2 years, he said, his voice taking on an edge I'd rarely heard before. I've encouraged you to get your CPA license, to look at better apartments, to think about career advancement. I've supported your work even when it seemed like you were settling for less than your potential. Now you're talking about throwing away a real opportunity to improve your situation because of some fantasy about being a cultural preservationist. The word settling revealed something about how David had always seen our relationship and my life choices. He'd been dating someone he considered capable of more, someone who just needed proper encouragement and practical guidance to achieve her potential. The fact that I might be satisfied with work I found meaningful, even if it wasn't financially ambitious, had apparently been something he'd hoped to change rather than accept. What if this collection is my potential? What if Grandma Maggie saw something in me that you and Bobby and Jess can't see? David stared at me for a long moment, his expression cycling through frustration, confusion and something that might have been disappointment. Then I guess we want different things for your future, he said finally. I want you to be practical and secure. You want to chase some inherited fantasy about being someone you're not qualified to become. After he left, I sat in the silence of my apartment, thinking about the conversation and what it had revealed about the gap between how David saw me and how I was beginning to see myself. For 2 years he'd been trying to help me become someone more conventionally successful, someone whose achievements could be measured in terms of income and professional advancement. He'd never considered that I might have different definitions of success, that I might value work that couldn't be easily quantified or quickly monetized. But Grandma Maggie had apparently seen something different. She'd recognized that my ability to listen carefully, to find value in overlooked details, and to care about things that needed preserving rather than profiting might actually qualify me for work that was more significant than anyone had imagined. She'd trusted me with decades of cultural preservation efforts, not because I had obvious credentials, but because I had instincts and priorities that aligned with what she'd been trying to accomplish. The question was whether I had the courage to trust her judgment over the practical advice of everyone who thought they knew what was best for me. Part 7: The First Encounter. The next morning brought a crisp autumn chill that made the mountains visible in sharp detail from my apartment window. I'd barely slept, my mind cycling through conversations with Bobby, Jess, and David, while trying to process the magnitude of what Grandma Maggie had entrusted to me. By 7 o'clock I was dressed and heading back to the house on Maple Street, determined to make a more systematic examination of the collection before my siblings could arrange for their own expert evaluation. The house felt different in the early morning light, empty and expectant, after yesterday's chaos of strangers pawing through decades of accumulated belongings. Frank's team had left the unsold items neatly organized in the living room, ready for donation pickup, but the rest of the space echoed with the hollow quality of rooms that had been systematically stripped of personality and history. I made my way down to the basement, switching on the harsh overhead lighting that made everything look more clinical than mysterious. In the clear morning light I could see both the careful organization of Grandma Maggie's storage system and the professional quality of supplies and materials that Frank had dismissed as craft store purchases. The climate-controlled environment, the acid-free storage materials, the sophisticated cataloging system, everything pointed to someone who understood exactly what was required to preserve valuable cultural artifacts. This time I approached the collection methodically, starting with the detailed inventory lists in Grandma Maggie's primary notebook. Each piece was assigned a number that corresponded to its storage location, condition assessment, and documentation file. The system was more sophisticated than anything I'd seen in the small museums and historical societies where I'd volunteered during college,
suggesting expertise that went far beyond casual hobby collecting. The first painting I unwrapped was a landscape of the French Broad River, dated 1959 and signed by an artist whose name appeared frequently in Grandma Maggie's correspondence files. According to her notes, she'd commissioned this piece directly from the artist during a period when he was struggling to pay rent on his studio space. The painting captured something essential about the way morning light hit the water during autumn, rendered with a technical skill that seemed far more sophisticated than anything I'd expected to find in a basement workshop. But it was the documentation that really impressed me. Grandma Maggie had photographed the work from multiple angles, noting details about brush technique and paint composition that suggested genuine expertise in artistic evaluation. She'd maintained correspondence with the artist for decades afterward, tracking his career development and market recognition with the thoroughness of a professional dealer or curator. The second piece was a portrait of an elderly mountain woman, her weathered hands holding traditional weaving tools while her eyes conveyed generations of cultural knowledge. The artist had signed it simply, "For Maggie who understands why these stories matter." According to the accompanying documentation, this had been painted during a cultural preservation project in 1963, when Grandma Maggie had served as liaison between visiting artists and local families who were willing to share their traditional crafts and stories. As I worked through piece after piece, a pattern emerged that was more sophisticated than simple art collecting. Grandma Maggie had apparently identified artists who were documenting Appalachian culture during a period of rapid change, and had provided them with both financial support and cultural access that enhanced the authenticity of their work. She hadn't just been buying paintings. She'd been facilitating cultural documentation by connecting artists with communities and traditions that were disappearing as modernization transformed the region. The correspondence files revealed the extent of her network within the regional art community. Gallery directors wrote to her seeking advice about authentication and provenance. Museum curators consulted with her about exhibition planning and cultural context. Academic researchers cited her as a source in papers about traditional crafts and regional artistic movement. The picture that emerged was of someone who'd been quietly recognized as an expert within professional circles, even while being dismissed as a hobbyist by her own family. But it was a letter dated just 6 months before her death that stopped me completely. Written by the director of a major regional museum, it thanked Grandma Maggie for her invaluable consultation on our upcoming exhibition of Appalachian folk art, and mentioned that your collection remains one of the most significant private archives of regional cultural documentation we've encountered. I sat on the basement floor, surrounded by decades of careful preservation work, trying to reconcile this evidence of professional recognition with the family narrative of Grandma Maggie as a sweet but simple woman who'd lived a quiet, unremarkable life.
The museum director's letter suggested that cultural institutions had valued her expertise and sought her collaboration on significant projects. Meanwhile, Bobby and Jess had spent years politely dismissing her work as eccentric pottering that wasn't worth discussing at family gatherings. The phone in my pocket buzzed with a text from Bobby. "Meeting with appraiser at 2 p.m. today, need access to basement. Don't move anything until professional evaluation." The assumption that he could schedule access to my inheritance without consulting me, combined with the instruction not to disturb anything until his chosen expert could evaluate it, crystallized the family dynamic that had been building since the funeral. Bobby was treating the collection as family property that required his professional oversight, despite Grandma Maggie's specific legal instructions about its ownership and management. I spent the next hour photographing everything with careful attention to the documentation systems Grandma Maggie had developed. Each piece was connected to detailed provenance records, condition assessments, and correspondence files that established its cultural significance and authentication status. The collection wasn't just valuable artwork, it was a comprehensive archive of a specific time and place, assembled by someone with deep knowledge of the artists and communities involved. But even as I marveled at the sophistication of what she'd assembled, I felt overwhelmed by the practical challenges of managing something this complex. The insurance requirements alone would probably cost more than my annual income. The climate-controlled storage, conservation assessments, and professional authentication processes would require expertise and resources I didn't possess. David had been right that I was completely unprepared for the practical realities of managing a collection this valuable. At the same time, I couldn't ignore what the collection represented about Grandma Maggie's life and work. She'd spent decades building relationships with artists, supporting cultural preservation efforts, and assembling documentation that captured something essential about Appalachian traditions during a period of profound change. The museum director's letter suggested that her work had been recognized as genuinely significant by people qualified to make such assessments. The sound of cars pulling into the driveway interrupted my systematic documentation. Through the basement window, I could see Bobby's BMW followed by a van marked Southeastern Art Appraisal Services. My time for private examination was apparently over, replaced by the professional evaluation process that would determine how the family approached decisions about the collection's future. Bobby appeared at the top of the basement stairs, followed by a middle-aged man in an expensive suit who carried himself with the confident authority of someone accustomed to making definitive judgments about valuable property. Frank Kowalski brought up the rear, his expression mixing curiosity with the defensive posture of someone whose professional assessment was being questioned. "Sarah, good, you're here," Bobby said, his tone carrying the brisk efficiency of someone taking charge of a situation that needed proper management. "This is Dr. Richard Thornfield from Southeastern Art Appraisal. He's going to help us understand what we're actually dealing with down here." Dr. Thornfield descended the stairs with the careful attention of someone evaluating property values, his eyes sweeping across the workshop with professional assessment techniques that seemed far more sophisticated than Frank's casual dismissal of craft supplies and junk. He moved directly to the storage area where I'd been working, examining the climate-controlled environment and preservation materials with obvious recognition of their professional quality. "Interesting setup," he murmured, running his fingers along the specialized storage containers and acid-free wrapping materials. "Someone invested significant resources in proper preservation technique." Frank shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing that his initial assessment might have missed something important. "The elderly owner seemed to have hoarding tendencies," he said defensively, "a lot of accumulated craft materials and amateur artwork. Nothing that seemed commercially viable." Thornfield picked up one of Grandma Maggie's documentation notebooks, scanning the detailed provenance records and authentication notes with growing interest. "This is museum-quality cataloging," he said, looking up at Bobby with an expression that suggested the situation was more complex than anticipated. "Someone with serious expertise assembled this documentation system." I watched Bobby's face as he processed this information, saw the moment when he realized that the junk he'd assigned to me for cleanup might actually represent significant value that would need to be properly evaluated and managed. His expression shifted to the controlled focus he used when real estate deals became more complicated than initial assessments had suggested. "What exactly are we looking at here?" Bobby asked, his voice taking on the careful neutrality he used when negotiations required strategic positioning. Dr. Thornfield was already unwrapping one of the stored paintings, handling it with the reverent care of someone who recognized potential value. As the landscape painting emerged from its protective covering, his expression changed to something approaching excitement. "This appears to be an original work by James Morrison," he said, examining the signature and paint technique with professional attention to authentication details. Morrison's work from this period has been appreciating significantly in recent years. Regional museums have been actively acquiring pieces from his documentation of Appalachian life during the casual mention of appreciating significantly and active acquisition by museums made Bobby's attention sharpen in a way I recognized from countless real estate negotiations. He was calculating potential values and market opportunities with the same analytical focus he brought to property investments. "What kind of value are we discussing?" Bobby asked, moving closer to examine the painting himself. Thornfield set down the Morrison landscape and reached for another wrapped piece, his movements becoming more urgent as he began to understand the scope of what was stored in the basement. "That's difficult to assess without examining the entire collection," he said, unwrapping what appeared to be a portrait of traditional mountain musicians. "But if the quality and authenticity remain consistent, we could be looking at a collection worth several $100,000, possibly more." The number hit the basement like a physical presence. Frank's face went white as he realized the magnitude of what he'd dismissed as worthless craft supplies. Bobby's expression shifted to the intense concentration he brought to major real estate transactions. And I felt something between excitement and terror as I understood that my life had just become infinitely more complicated than anything I'd ever imagined. Thornfield's preliminary assessment transformed the basement from a cluttered workshop into a crime scene where every detail required careful examination and documentation. He spent the next 3 hours methodically unwrapping and photographing each piece while maintaining detailed notes about attribution, condition, and potential market value. Bobby positioned himself as the primary family contact, answering questions about provenance and family history with confident authority despite having shown no previous interest in Grandma Maggie's artistic activity. Frank Kowalski lurked in the background, his professional reputation clearly damaged by his spectacular failure to recognize valuable artwork during his estate sale preparation. He kept making defensive comments about the poor lighting and cluttered conditions that had made proper evaluation difficult, but everyone could see that he'd simply dismissed everything in the basement, without conducting the kind of systematic examination that his clients had paid him to provide. The Morrison alone could be worth $40,000 to $60,000, Dr. Thornfield said, documenting the landscape painting with professional photography equipment he'd retrieved from his van. Morrison's work from this period is considered essential documentation of pre-interstate Appalachian life. Museums compete actively for authenticated pieces from his cultural preservation series. I watched Bobby process this information with the calculating expression he used when determining offer strategies for high-value property. He was already thinking about authentication procedures, insurance requirements, and market timing for potential sales. The collection was being transformed from cultural inheritance into investment opportunity, each piece valued primarily for its contribution to total asset worth. What about authentication procedures? Bobby asked, his real estate background making him automatically focused on due diligence and verification processes. How do we establish definitive provenance and market value for insurance and sales purposes? Dr. Thornfield was examining a portrait of mountain musicians, his attention focused on brush techniques and aging patterns that would confirm or challenge attribution claims. The documentation your grandmother maintained is extraordinary, he said, consulting Grandma Maggie's detailed provenance records. She has correspondence with the artists, photographs of works in progress, even receipts for materials and commissioned pieces. This level of documentation is unusual even for professional collectors. The casual reference to Grandma Maggie as a professional collector seemed to surprise Bobby, who'd clearly never considered that her basement activities might represent serious cultural work rather than eccentric hobby pursuits. He picked up one of her notebooks, scanning the detailed records with growing recognition that he'd fundamentally misunderstood what she'd been accomplishing during those hours she'd spent puttering around in her workshop. She never mentioned any of this to the family, Bobby said, his voice carrying the defensive tone he used when clients questioned his knowledge of property histories. We assumed she was doing craft projects or amateur painting. If we'd known she was assembling a valuable collection, we would have taken proper security and insurance precautions. The suggestion that Grandma Maggie had somehow failed to properly communicate the significance of her work ignored the reality that Bobby and Jess had consistently dismissed her attempts to share her excitement about her project. I remembered countless family gatherings where she'd tried to describe what she was working on, only to be interrupted or redirected to more conventional topics of conversation. Actually, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. She tried to tell us about her work many times. We just weren't listening. Bobby shot me a look that suggested this wasn't the appropriate time for family criticism, especially in front of a professional appraiser who was documenting everything for what would clearly become complex legal and financial proceedings. He was treating the situation like a real estate transaction that required unified family presentation rather than internal disagreements that might complicate negotiations. Thornfield unwrapped another piece revealing a detailed study of traditional mountain crafts that showed several elderly women demonstrating weaving techniques that had been passed down through generations. The painting captured not just the physical process of traditional work but something essential about the cultural knowledge being transmitted between generations of mountain women. This appears to be part of a series documenting traditional crafts before they disappeared, Thornfield said, consulting Grandma Maggie's notes about the artist and the circumstances of the painting's creation. Your grandmother apparently provided access to families and communities that most outsiders never would have encountered. These artists were documenting cultural traditions that were literally disappearing as modernization changed mountain life. The description of Grandma Maggie as someone who'd provided access to families and communities suggested a level of cultural integration and respect that went far beyond casual art collecting. She'd apparently served as a bridge between artists and traditional communities, using her local knowledge and trusted relationships to facilitate cultural documentation that wouldn't have been possible without her involvement. How many pieces are we dealing with total? Bobby asked, his focus remaining on inventory and valuation rather than cultural significance. Dr. Thornfield consulted Grandma Maggie's master inventory list, his expression growing more impressed as he reviewed the scope of what she'd assembled. According to her records, there are 47 major pieces, plus numerous sketches, studies, and related material. If the quality remains consistent with what I've examined so far, we're looking at a collection worth anywhere from $400,000 to potentially over $1 million, depending on current market conditions and authentication results. The numbers hit the basement like a physical force. Frank Kowalski looked like he might be sick as he calculated how much potential commission he'd dismissed as worthless junk. Bobby's expression shifted to the intense focus he brought to major real estate deals, and I felt the walls of my small, manageable life crumbling as I tried to process what it might mean to inherit assets worth more than I'd ever imagined earning in my entire career. "We'll need comprehensive authentication and insurance evaluation," Bobby said, already shifting into business management mode. "Professional storage, security consultation, market analysis for optimal disposal timing. This is going to require serious coordination and expertise." The casual assumption that disposal was the obvious goal, that the collection existed primarily to be converted into cash as efficiently as possible, made something tighten in my chest. Bobby was approaching Grandma Maggie's lifework like any other inherited asset that needed to be liquidated for maximum return on investment. "What if we don't want to sell everything immediately?" I asked, my voice carrying more challenge than I'd intended. Bobby looked at me with the patient expression he used when clients suggested impractical alternatives to straightforward market transactions. "Sarah, we're talking about assets worth potentially over $1 million. You can't just keep them in a basement because they have sentimental value. This requires professional management, proper insurance, climate-controlled storage, conservation assessment. The carrying costs alone would be enormous." Thornfield was photographing another piece, but I could tell he was listening to our conversation with the professional interest of someone who'd witnessed many family disputes over inherited artwork. His expression suggested he'd seen this dynamic before, family members discovering unexpected value in a relative's collection, and immediately disagreeing about preservation versus liquidation. "The cultural significance might be as important as market value," Thornfield said carefully, his tone diplomatically neutral. "This collection documents a specific time and place in Appalachian history. Some museums might be interested in acquisition or partnership arrangements that could preserve the collection's integrity while providing financial benefits to the estate. The suggestion that museums might want to acquire the collection as a unified cultural archive rather than individual pieces for resale opened possibilities I hadn't considered. Grandma Maggie's work might be valuable not just as individual artworks, but as a comprehensive documentation of cultural traditions during a period of historical change. "What kind of partnership arrangement?" I asked, ignoring Bobby's expression of impatience with alternatives to straightforward liquidation. Dr. Thornfield set down his camera and consulted his notes about institutional interest in regional cultural collections. "Several universities and museums have been actively seeking to expand their holdings of Appalachian cultural documentation from this period. A collection this comprehensive and well-documented might be suitable for donation with significant tax advantages, or partnership arrangements where institutions provide conservation and security, while families retain ownership." Bobby was already shaking his head before Dr. Thornfield finished explaining the alternatives. "We're not talking about tax write-offs or academic partnerships," he said firmly. "We're talking about a valuable financial asset that needs to be properly managed and liquidated. Sarah doesn't have the resources or expertise to manage ongoing institutional relationships or conservation requirements." The automatic assumption that I couldn't handle complex arrangements, that my only reasonable option was to accept whatever liquidation strategy Bobby considered most efficient, crystallized the family dynamic that had been building since the funeral. He was treating my inheritance like property that required his professional management, rather than something I had the right to handle according to my own priorities and values. "Maybe I want to learn how to manage it," I said, my voice stronger than I'd expected. "Maybe I want to understand what Grandma Maggie was trying to accomplish before I decide how to handle what she left me." The basement fell silent except for the hum of the climate control system that Grandma Maggie had installed to protect her collection. Dr. Thornfield continued his documentation work with professional discretion, but I could sense his awareness of the family tension that was building around decisions about the collection's future. Bobby moved closer, his expression shifting to the controlled patience he used when clients needed to be guided away from unrealistic expectations toward practical solutions. "Look, I understand this is emotional, but we can't let sentiment override practical consideration. This collection requires expertise and resources that none of us currently possess. The responsible thing is to work with professionals to maximize its value and use the proceeds wisely. The word responsible felt like a slap. Bobby was essentially arguing that any decision other than immediate liquidation was inherently irresponsible, that honoring Grandma Maggie's cultural preservation work was less important than converting her collection to cash that could solve conventional financial problems. What if being responsible means continuing the work she started? I asked. What if she left this to me because she trusted me to understand why it mattered, not because she wanted me to sell it as quickly as possible? Bobby's expression hardened in a way I recognized from countless childhood arguments where he'd eventually resorted to pulling rank as the older, more accomplished sibling. Sarah, you're a part-time librarian who lives in a studio apartment. You're not qualified to manage $1 million art collection or make complex decisions about cultural preservation. This isn't about sentiment or family loyalty. It's about practical reality. The dismissal of my qualifications, the assumption that my modest lifestyle disqualified me from making important decisions about my own inheritance, made something snap inside me. Bobby was using the same condescending tone he'd used throughout our childhood whenever I'd suggested alternatives to his authoritative plans. Maybe qualifications aren't just about income and professional titles, I said, my voice carrying an edge that surprised everyone in the basement. Maybe they're about listening when someone tries to share what matters to them, about recognizing value that can't be immediately converted to cash. Dr. Thornfield cleared his throat diplomatically, his professional experience clearly suggesting that family disputes over inherited artwork rarely led to optimal outcomes for anyone involved. Perhaps we should focus on completing the assessment before making decisions about long-term management, he suggested. Understanding the full scope and value of the collection will provide a foundation for whatever direction the family ultimately chooses. But as I looked around the basement at decades of Grandma Maggie's careful preservation work, at documentation that revealed sophisticated cultural knowledge and professional recognition, I realized that the family had already chosen their direction. Bobby and Jess saw valuable assets that needed efficient management and profitable liquidation. I was beginning to see something entirely different, a legacy that represented everything they'd never understood about the woman who'd raised. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.